So I'll give you a heads up when the participants fill up.
Great.
And they are flowing fast.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to kick off today's webinar that is co-organized by nonprofit organizations, IAVI and Wellcome. My name is Aisha Sitlani, and I am an Associate Vice President at IAVI, a nonprofit organization whose mission is to translate scientific innovations into affordable and accessible global health solutions. Today's event will expand on recommendations to enable broader access to monoclonal antibodies, presented in the August 2020 Call to Action report, published by IAVI and Wellcome. Today's webinar is part one of a two-part webinar series on strengthening regulatory and policy frameworks to expand access to biologics in Africa. And today's session will focus on monoclonal antibodies. Next slide, please. I also want to thank our donors on this slide. Next slide. As I said, it is part one of a two-part webinar series on strengthening regulatory and policy frameworks to expand access to biologics in Africa. Today we will be focusing on monoclonal antibodies. Part two of this series will be scheduled in September, the date to be determined soon. We will start today's event with some context setting and introductory remarks, followed by two sessions of presentations and panel discussions to discuss regional and global collaborative solutions to strengthen and harmonize regulatory and policy frameworks, all with the goal to enable broader and more timely access to monoclonal antibodies in Africa. And then we will also encourage audience participation. So throughout the webinar, if you could kindly, if there are questions, put them in the chat. We will triage questions so that in the end, we will open it up for audience participation and a Q&A. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mark Feinberg, President and CEO of IAVI, where he leads a global team working to advance the development of vaccines and other biomedical innovations to protect against infection with HIV, COVID-19, TB, and other infectious diseases that disproportionately impact low and middle income countries. Prior to joining IAVI in late 2015, Mark served as Chief Public Health and Scientific Officer with Merck Vaccines. In this role, He helped to advance the development and global availability of vaccines against rotavirus, human papillomavirus, Ebola, and other infectious diseases. Today, Mark will be sharing results from a recently published report by IAVI and Wellcome, which is a call to action, as I mentioned, to expand global access to monoclonal antibodies. This work highlights the challenges and opportunities to enable access to mAbs for all diseases in low and middle income countries and presents recommendations to catalyze global commitment and action. To set the context for today's webinar, I will now turn it over to Mark to share some of the high-level findings from this work and recommendations of the report. Thank you. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Aisha, and thanks very much to all the participants in the meeting and all of the panelists. And I especially want to thank our partners at who have really been tremendous in working with us to try to call attention and present solutions to what we believe is a significant global inequity. I think all of us know very well the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown a bright light on inequities to access to innovative biologic solutions around the world. If people can mute if they're not speaking at this point, that would be great. Clearly the COVID pandemic has highlighted those inequities, but those inequities are not new. And we and a number of stakeholders have been very concerned about access to really what is the cutting edge of biomedical innovation, monoclonal antibodies, which are being used for the treatment and prevention of many non-communicable diseases, including cancer and autoimmune diseases, as well as infectious diseases ranging from Ebola, COVID, and on the horizon, additional important diseases like HIV. So finding a way to enable global access in an equitable way is critical. And the focus of today's discussion is really on the regulatory frameworks and policy frameworks that are necessary to enable greater access. Next slide, please. This is the report that Aisha referred to, and you can find it on the websites listed here, and these materials will be available to the participants. This was published late last year. It grew out of the Wellcome concern and IAVI's concern and the concerns of many stakeholders that monoclonal antibodies have really revolutionized modern medicine, but access to them has really been limited to high-income countries and people who are either wealthy or well-insured, and access in many parts of the world where the diseases are also prevalent, and in some instances more prevalent, is severely limited. And we tried to understand the magnitude of this challenge and what can be done to overcome it. And it was very clear that there are certain barriers, including important ones that are going to be discussed today, about limited. Can you go back to the previous slide, please? Thanks. Limited awareness of the health and economic value of monoclonal antibodies, unclear regulatory processes in many countries with limited or capabilities in this area. The sort of market equation driving economics is not worked out to enable broader access. The WHO pre-qualification processes have still been in early stages. The procurement mechanisms are not defined the way they are for other products like vaccines, and there really hasn't been business model and partnership model innovation with a focus on access and public health impact. And we thought it was critically important to address this issue. It's spelled out in the report, and I encourage you to read it, and it's going to be the focus of today's discussion. Next slide, please. If you actually look at monoclonal antibodies, not only have they revolutionized treatment of very serious diseases, including the ones I've mentioned, but they really are now the major focus of the product development pipelines for many multinational pharmaceutical companies. So the future of biomedical innovations includes a key role for monoclonal antibodies. So the gap that we're going to describe in access is going to widen with time rather than narrow unless we can do something about it. And it's pretty clear, as highlighted on this slide, that if you look at where the monoclonal antibodies are registered and available, there's tremendous global inequities. And with respect to Africa specifically, less than 1% of the global sales sales of monoclonal antibodies are on the African continent. And as we'll talk about, the antibodies that are available in Africa are not available in the public health systems, and thus they're unavailable and inaccessible for the vast majority of people living on the continent. Next slide, please. You can really look at one major reason driving this inequity is really the high price of monoclonal antibodies. And you can see that in high income countries, these treatments are available for over $100,000 a year in many instances. And if you actually look at the prices, they're quite high across the board because they're very profitable products. But if you actually look at where the antibodies are available, it highlights this disparity quite clearly, that really in many LMICs, the antibodies are simply not available for diseases that are very prevalent there, and this clearly needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. But it's not like the diseases that are targeted by leading monoclonal antibodies are not prevalent in countries in Africa or other LMICs around the world, because many of them are prevalent really everywhere, and in a number of instances, both non-communicable diseases targeted by the monoclonals as well as infectious diseases targeted by the monoclonals are as prevalent, if not more prevalent, in many countries in Africa and in other LMIC contexts. Next slide, please. There are a number of barriers that we've talked about. It's, one is the unclear market size, unclear demand, on a lack of appreciation of the public health and medical value of these, the regulatory processes, as we've talked about, and we'll delve into more. I think there's opportunity for, new partnerships and new connections to address these issues, and we look forward to those discussions today. The process for monoclonal antibody registration in Africa and other LMIC contexts is really not well developed and needs additional support. Next slide, please. There is work going on at the WHO, but until relatively recently, the WHO did not have a pre-qualification process for monoclonal antibodies. They're working hard to put that in place, and they are also adding, importantly, monoclonal antibodies to the essential medicines list. And I think this is a step forward, but it's still a work in progress. There is work going on to also, clarified preferred product characteristics documents that would be at least targeting infectious disease relevant monoclonal antibodies that will be helpful in, guiding in-country decision-making and prioritization. So there's work taking place, but there's more work to do. And I think all of us have a role to play in advocating for more and faster progress collectively. Next slide, please. Really what the focus of today's discussion, when we think about the barriers that were laid out in the report, ranging from solutions that could address those barriers in terms of greater advocacy, addressing policy and regulatory frameworks, innovation, both in technologies in manufacturing, discovery, and delivery, but also innovation in business models. The focus today clearly is on the policy and regulatory environment, and Helen will be making some comments about that. Next slide, please. With that, I will conclude and welcome the contributions of my friend and colleague, Dr. Helen Reese, and I'll turn it back to Aisha.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you so much, Helen, as well, for really supporting this event and for all your guidance in designing this webinar. I just want to say a couple of words about Dr. Helen Reese, who is a professor and executive director of the Wits Reproductive Health and HIV Institute at the University of the Witwatersrand, South Africa, and is internationally renowned for her research and policy work in vaccines, HIV, and reproductive health. To mention just a few of her many important affiliations in global health, Helen chairs the Principal Vaccine Advisory Group to the WHO Regional Office for Africa, is a member of the Board of Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, Gavi, and serves on the board for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness, CEPI. Dr. Reese is appointed to various South African ministerial committees that inform the Minister of Health on COVID-19. She is also chair of the South African Health Products Regulatory Authority, SAPRA. I will turn it over to Dr. Reese to provide opening remarks for today's webinar, and thank you so much, Dr. Reese.
Thank you very much, Aisha, and to Mark. I think this is so timely that we should be having this discussion in many, many ways. We're talking about monoclonal antibodies and their lack of access and how we can increase access. But I'm really reminded about a whole lot of other products in our history, the history of many of us on this call, and perhaps before some of your time, that we also kind of accepted that we wouldn't have. And I'm going back to things like antiretrovirals. The African region, for a while, it was, can't be done, too expensive, too complex, people won't manage the regimens, and all sorts of assumptions that proved not to be true. I was thinking about access to new vaccines. Access to new vaccines was really prohibited, and yet the countries that needed them most, particularly for childhood vaccines, were in the low middle income countries in the African region in particular. And that was transformed by an initiative from Gavi. The activism around HIV transformed access to ARVs. And now we're looking at a new category of medicines. And the old temptation to say too complicated, too expensive, not for us, that has now got to be put to one side. We shouldn't require activists any longer. But what we do require, and this is to Mark and to Wellcome and IAVI, is that we do require people to raise the importance of this as a topic so that we can actually move the agenda on. And webinars like this will really start to do that. So in terms of the thinking about this, and Mark, I'm going to echo your words, nothing has brought the issue of regulation into such focus as this COVID pandemic. Because we are seeing once again that our access to vaccines in the African region and in many other LMICs is really limited when compared to rich countries. There are many reasons for this, vaccine hoarding, vaccine inequity, closing of borders for export, many, many reasons that we should think of, refusal to have IP exchange, lack of sufficient manufacturing exchange, technical exchange. But one of the reasons for it that has really come to the fore is also that our systems are not strong enough to support all sorts of aspects that are required to actually get the vaccines through. So what has that really taught us? If you think about the importance of regulators, and many of you on this call, I'm going to tell you stuff that you know. I mean, we are responsible for safety, quality, and efficacy of products that get licensed through the various regulators in countries. We're also responsible for looking at manufacturing, and we've seen with the COVID vaccines how important that is, often not talked about, but on this panel we will be talking about it. In the African region, many LMICs, the post-marketing side of things, the safety monitoring. And for biologicals in particular, particularly new ones in new populations, this is something that we need to think about. And the other thing we're responsible for that we need to do a lot more of, we all know it, is communication, is actually talking to the public about what the regulator's doing, why some things are safe and are being introduced, why we're monitoring what we know is not safe. We're not well enough capacitated to look at that. If you think about the issues that occur if you have ineffective and weak regulatory systems, the first thing is delays. Delays because our systems are clunky and often old-fashioned, although I think that is now changing. And WHO is now setting standards and bars by which you can start to see what's required and measure yourself as a regulatory authority. But delays have an impact on access. Because if we are delayed in approving either a clinical trial or in particular registration or licensure of a product, that means that we're not going to get access. If we delay, it also means that competitive pricing might not be there. And the other thing is that we're increasingly aware, and we're seeing this now already with vaccines, and particularly in our regions, is that the introduction of substandard or counterfeit products has enormous potential, never more than in a pandemic. Money can be made through this. So if you have a weak regulatory infrastructure, these are some of the consequences and the so what. And the bottom line is that then we face inequity. If we then think about where we've gone with regulatory science, and I'm thinking particularly about the African region now. I mean, if we look back 15, 20 years, and I know some of the people on the panel will talk about this because they've been involved for many years looking at regulatory issues around biologicals. If we look back over time, we were really, regulatory authorities were weak. Our systems, as I say, were often prolonged. They weren't smart systems. And the result was that regulators themselves became a barrier to approvals and to access. So we moved from there. Now we are seeing across the African region, for example, that many regulatory authorities are really putting their hands up and actually saying, you know, we want to improve our standards. We understand what the norms and the bars are, and we're going to chase after those. Many regulatory authorities are doing that. The second thing that's happening in the region, and this is happening in other regions as well, is we're seeing national, sub-regional coalitions of regulators to collectively start to review applications, both clinical trial applications in some instances, as we've seen from AVRF, or licensure applications. And the advantage of that reflects one of our other big challenges in the region, and that is scarce human resources with skills. We just simply don't have the luxury of lots and lots of people who are going to help us review things. So actually exchange is very important. And we're now moving on to the talk and the action that will move towards an African Medicines Agency, similar to the European Medicines Agency, that will start to even get a bigger, higher level coalition of expertise. Why is that important? As I say, skills lack. But also there's no need to repeat things. And I think that it took us many years to recognize this from the regulatory side. Now, one of the things that is really talked about a lot is reliance. That can be in the form of regional, sub-regional groups getting together, but reliance also focuses regulatory authorities in less well-resourced settings to partner with regulatory authorities in better resource settings so that information can be exchanged. And you've seen the importance of reliance, particularly as a little cameo with the COVID vaccines and the role that WHO is really starting to play in things like, in this case, an emergency use licensure, that then countries who are working with WHO can actually pull in and accelerate access. So I think that this discussion that we're going to have now, this webinar, is incredibly important for monoclonal antibodies, because as I said right at the beginning, the temptation is to say those are medicines for the rich. They're things that you have there. They are phenomenally expensive in some cases. They can be for diseases that we tend to sort of leave, like rheumatoid arthritis, perhaps with medicines that are not the best and yet are massively debilitating diseases. And of course, areas like oncology, and now, of course, in the infectious disease field, including HIV. So, you know, this is going to be an incredibly important accelerating process. I'm hoping, Mark, through the IAVI Wellcome initiative. That document is excellent. I really encourage you to read it. And I'm looking forward to hearing colleagues on the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helen. That was excellent and really highlights some of the key points that are going to be discussed at today's panel, both panel discussions. So really appreciate the opening remarks by both you as well as Mark. We will now move into session one, and session one will be introduced by a presentation from Freya Hopper. I would like to introduce her. She's policy advisor for Wellcome. Freya is currently leading a project on sustainable vaccine innovation ecosystems at Wellcome, and she'll be kicking off the session with a short presentation entitled Regulatory Systems Enabling Access to Complex Products. And after Freya's short presentation, we will go and start the panel discussion number one. Over to you, Freya.
Thanks, Aisha. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Aisha said, I work in vaccines, and I think I'm speaking today because it's really striking that actually, while some elements are very vaccines or indeed monoclonal antibody specific, there's a huge amount of overlap in the challenges and potential solutions, particularly within the regulatory space. Could you go to the next slide, please? So effective regulation is critical to ensure that safe, high quality and effective products are on the market. But ineffective regulatory systems can be a roadblock. And as Helen spoke about, because regulatory oversight goes across the whole value chain, these potential roadblocks can affect everything: research and development, market entry, manufacturing supply, and product development and product deployment, as well as product lifecycle. And this impacts equity and access, whether that's high-income countries getting products on the market years before low-income countries, research and innovation disproportionately being carried out and geared towards high-income country issues, or supply issues disproportionately affecting low-income countries. And clearly there are many underlying factors at play here, not least the role of money, but we know regulatory barriers are an underlying constant. And this is particularly salient for complex products like monoclonal antibodies, vaccines, and other biologicals. Next, please. There have been countless reports, papers, and initiatives that recognize the crucial role of regulation as a key enabler of equitable access. Far too many to name, and I've only put a small selection on the screen here. But for participants today, and as Mark spoke about in a lot more detail, I'd really like to draw out the call to action we at Wellcome and IAVI made on expanding access to monoclonal antibody-based products. Next, please. So this is an excerpt from the Wellcome IAVI monoclonal report. Apologies if it's too small to read, but as Helen and Mark have both done, I really encourage you to read the full report. If you can't see it on screen now. And as Mark spoke about, in order to get access, we need quality products to be both available and affordable. And overcoming regulatory barriers, including cutting the delay in registrations, better defining regulatory policies, and increasing harmonization are really important to increasing availability of safe and effective products. And the report also highlights the importance of looking beyond regulation towards how these products get through policy and procurement pathways in order to find the best solutions to increase the availability of these products for the people that need them. Next slide, please. So what lessons can we learn from vaccines? As Aisha mentioned, I'm working on a project at the moment to support equitable access to vaccine innovation, and specifically looking at how best to support vaccines getting through late-stage development into use, particularly for vaccines without a high-income market and for vaccines for outbreaks and epidemics. As part of this work, we recognize that regulatory barriers are a key element, and so we commissioned Rochelle Harris and Charles River Associates to conduct an analysis of regulatory strengthening and resilience initiatives. What works? What are critical enablers? What are key limiting factors, and so on? The work is currently ongoing, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the many experts who have kindly provided their insights so far, or who will be interviewed soon. And I know many of you are actually on the call today. I'm very excited to share some early emerging findings. The work is due to finish over the summer, and we look forward to sharing the full findings in early September during the second webinar in this series. So the first is some key principles. Context is vital, and one size does not fit all. A very salient example at the moment, of course, what works in a pandemic might be different to a local outbreak or to endemic disease of which routine immunization is required. Another example, the difference between national, regional, continental, or global approaches. As Helen spoke about, regulatory resources worldwide are limited, and so collaborative approaches, information sharing, work sharing, reliance, mutual recognition and decision-making, as well as convergence and harmonizations of policies and processes, can be used to support more efficient delivery of certain regulatory functions. For all of these collaborative efforts, some degree of national competence is vital, including knowing how to do reliance well. And some regulatory activities must be done at a national level, such as pharmacovigilance, post-marketing surveillance, enforcement, but can also feed into a more joined up approach to regulatory decision-making, advancement of clinical knowledge, and regulatory science. And an approach which brings in regional centers of expertise, such as the R-Cores, builds on national strengthening and adds to a distributed model. In summary, we need regulatory systems with strong fundamentals and investment in all levels, national, regional, continental, global, to get the best solution for different contexts. Of course, it almost goes without saying that we must work together to build on what's already achieved. Adding more noise to an already complex and fragmented landscape might do more harm than good, however well-intentioned. So building on and supporting what's already in train is the best way to get results. In the African context, the excellent work of AVRF, the AMRH, the African Regulatory Task Force, and the work towards an African Medicines Agency all stand out, as does the work of WHO to develop consistent standards, strengthen the workforce, build networks, and strengthen national regulatory agencies, as well as regional approaches. Second, some emerging findings on key lessons from our existing initiatives. So the first is what I call the soft factors, the importance of trust, relationships between regulators, the ability to share information and knowledge, supported by twinning programs, fellowships, meetings, as well as good governance and transparent regulatory processes. And then the hard factors. What are the legal frameworks? How do they support and promote collaborative working, including uptake of decisions made through these collaborative processes? What infrastructure, for example, to enable secure sharing of confidential information, is in place? Do the organizational structures work, including are there physically enough staff to do the required work? And project management is often called out as a key discipline that's often lacking. Are processes efficient with capabilities for continuous improvement, for faster decision making, and to avoid duplication of effort? And finally, the crux has to be sustainability. How can we ensure that benefits last? Financing clearly is critical, and we need user fee models that support regulatory initiatives while representing value to the industry who are paying them. There needs to be investment in workforce, both in terms of number of people and in strengthening capabilities of individuals, along with viable plans for retention of skilled staff that must include decent salaries and clear professional progression pathways, as well as a level of comfort that skilled staff moving to work for industry can also have benefits. And of course, buy-in is critical. We need sustained political interest and enthusiasm, and it's very exciting to see, for example, the recent push in countries ratifying the AMA treaty. And finally, next, please, the time is now. The COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated once again the criticality of strong regulators and of systems that can take the best risk-benefit decisions for the context. As for COVID, to accept regulatory decisions and rapidly enable access to products. But we must seize this moment. I'm going to quote Emmanuel Maduro from the Federation of African Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations in last week's World Local Production Forum. This has been a wake-up call, but we've had so many wake-up calls, and the challenge for us now is to stay awake. Thank you so much. Back to you, Aisha.
Thank you so much, Freya. That was excellent and really a great segue to start the first panel. I would like to introduce Dr. David Mukanga, who is Senior Program Officer for Regulatory Affairs, Africa Systems at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where he is responsible for Africa regulatory systems strengthening. David supports the development of harmonized, transparent, and predictable regulatory systems in Africa, as well as regulatory preparedness of R&D in emergencies. We're just so delighted to have David moderate today's first panel that will be discussing how regulatory systems can be enhanced across the African continent to enable broad and timely access to innovative monoclonal antibodies. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Ayesha, for that introduction. I want to thank as well Wellcome and IAVI for organizing this very important panel, webinar and panel discussions at this time. Very, very important subject here that we're addressing today. And I want to also thank Mark, Helen, and Freya. They've really set a very nice foundation for the discussions that we're going to have over the next 30 minutes for this first panel. So allow me introduce the panelists. We're very honored and privileged today to have 4 excellent panelists joining us. Professor Diki Akamori is Regional Advisor for Vaccine Regulation at the WHO Regional Office for Africa and leads the Africa Vaccine Regulatory Forum Secretariat that's based out of WHO Afro. We have, as the second panelist, is Ms. Margaret Domondo Sigonda, who is Head of Health at AUDA NEPAD, and Margaret has been very much a part of the regulatory harmonization journey over the last decade. She's been a pillar of this work, driving the MRH initiative, the AMA work, etc. We're also very privileged to have Dr. Henry Leng, who is coming to us from SAPRA. Dr. Leng is a researcher and an expert and has been really involved in the assessment of biological products there at SAPRA and will bring perspectives from a regulator actively involved in assessing biological products. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Mugonda from the University of Zimbabwe, who is very much active in the research field and is involved in a network of monoclonal antibodies for HIV prevention studies. And very pleased to have you, Dr. Mugonda, joining us. So if you will allow me, I'm going to pose the first question to Margaret. Margaret, as you had the context around the issue of monoclonal antibodies and how to address the barriers, the very limited access to these products, how can we strengthen and harmonize the legal frameworks, guidelines, and training for regulation of monoclonal antibodies? Can we, for example, leverage the experience gained from other medical products working through regional economic blocks? Over to you, Margaret.
And can I ask the panelists to get on video as well as unmute for panel 1?
I seem to be missing Margaret. Margaret, are you here? Okay, if you'll allow me, and the rest of the panelists, as you turn on your videos on. Dickie, would you like to start us off on this discussion around, how we can strengthen legal and regulatory frameworks for regulating monoclonals and the lessons that we can draw from the harmonization work with other products in the regional communities? I know you're working very closely with those as well from an AVRF perspective.
Well, thank you very much, David. And let me also thank the previous speakers for setting the stage so well, highlighting first and foremost the importance of the use of monoclonal antibodies and the disparity or inequity in access, leaving the African continent in a way deprived from something so good that could also help not just to provide relief, but also to address some priority diseases of the continent. Now, let me begin by let me also add that when we look at regulatory capacity, or we look at the regulatory strength of countries to deliver on access to health products, I think we should look at it broadly. What COVID-19 has taught us is that, particularly in the settings of a pandemic, there will be a variety of products. They will range from anything from therapeutics to vaccines and diagnostics. And of course, they will include monoclonal antibodies. Therefore, in looking at this, we should be broad-minded in ensuring that the capacity which is built is one that addresses all the range of products that we can have. We also need to understand one other fundamental issue which affects the African region. And I think Mark alluded to this in his earlier statements, in describing the report, and also the update that came from the work around the Wellcome Trust, trying to establish some of the issues around regulatory capacity. That, most of our regulatory systems of the countries are limited in terms of the human resource capacity. I mean, they do not have the luxury of having departments for products. So they work across a range of products, leveraging the capacities that they have been able to establish over the years with all the training and capacity building coming through the WHO and partners. And therefore, when it comes to addressing products, they tend to have people multitasking. Of course, we would like to move away from there and to get to a point where you have people who have the specialization, who have the capacity to address specific products such as monoclonal antibodies. Now, having said that, yes, the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization has actually set the scene for what we would call a common legal framework, a legal framework that ensures that products are addressed adequately, and that empowers and gives the mandates and clearly defines what regulators in each country, each member state ought to be doing, and that this is consistently the same. And the good thing is the work by the AMRH and the African Union in general in providing what fundamentally could be the building block for a regulatory system. Now, having said this, let me define what happens in the region in terms of the legal and regulatory frameworks. Much of the regulatory frameworks and the work that, the legal framework that governs the work of regulators on the continent, these were largely inherited from colonial era, and we have a dichotomy of two systems. We have what you can call the French-speaking system that establishes a pharmacy department within the Ministry of Health, which is given the responsibility of looking after all pharmaceuticals, including biologicals and monoclonal antibodies, of course. Then you have in the some of the English-speaking countries a regulatory system which has the resemblance of a full drugs authority that is also independent with a clear mandate established to address the regulatory the regulation of medical products. Now, whereas in the French system, the regulatory authorities tend to be relatively, I would say, I don't want to say weak, but that they tend not to take on this full responsibility for all products. In the English-speaking countries, on the other hand, this is quite clear, and most of the food and drugs authorities that we know now in many countries have this capacity. Therefore, what the framework developed does is to help transform all of these two types of models into a clear model with a clear mandate, establishing a regulatory authority which is independent, which is capable of providing all the services, which is capable of being resourced directly as an authority primarily by the government, which owns the regulatory authority, and for it to establish itself, set up its own, set of, priorities, and build itself into a regulatory system capable of addressing all products. And so far, in doing this, pharmaceuticals have taken the lead, and unfortunately, the biologicals have lagged behind, but are gradually catching up with the pharmaceutical and non-biologics, including monoclonal antibodies. But the work around the AMRH has really served as the basis now for us to propel all countries in the same direction, establish transparent systems with good governance, with clear mandates, capable of addressing all products, including monoclonal antibodies. And their capacity building will become essential. That's why I want to emphasize on this. So all the partners around the table know that if we're going to achieve what we wish to see based on this report and the landscape analysis which has been done, we will need to invest more in capacity building. We need to invest more in different aspects of capacity building to enable the regulators deliver adequately on their component of the work to ensure that there's access to these vital products. And I'll pause here. Thank you very much. And
thank you very much, Dickie. Very, very helpful. And do please adjust your camera a little bit. We are losing part of your face here. Yes, that's getting better. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those interventions, Dickie. Very briefly, Margaret, in 30 seconds, and sorry, I didn't start with you. I think you had a little connection issue. Just from your experience with the work with the regional economic blocks, do you see any opportunity there to leverage the work that has been undertaken to develop very effective frameworks for regulating monoclonal antibodies, whether that is through them working together through work sharing or reliance, etc.?
Thank you very much, David. And I must first thank the organizers for inviting AUD and NEPAD to be part of this discussion. And my apologies, as you rightly said, I've had problems with the internet connectivity. But just to respond to the questioning, and I think what I should also say is to thank IAVI and Wellcome Trust for a very good report that lays down the issues around monoclonal antibodies and the issues about regulation and how best we can work together to advance, the access to these products. And so when it comes to the work that we've done, I think Dickie has done a very good job to sort of give that background in terms of the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative, the work that we've done so far. Now, when it comes to leveraging on that, I think we must all remember that the initiative started more than 10 years back, and there's been a lot of groundwork in terms of really trying to build a foundation, the legal framework, the harmonizing of the standards, for regulation and the practice, and also putting in place the structures. That has really helped us to lay a foundation. And so, and I think the other good thing that we need to also take into account is the fact that through the regional platform, we've been able to help countries with limited capacity to really participate, not only in the harmonization process, but also in the joint reviews, work sharing, and through that, they've been able to build not only capacity, the trust and all that. So that in itself has laid a very good foundation. And so we actually undertook a stepwise approach, knowing clearly the limited capacity that countries have on the continent. We started with generic medicines, and slowly we started moving into other products and regulatory streams of work. And therefore, now that we are discussing about regulation of monoclonal antibodies, I think it is just timely that the foundation has been laid in terms of the legal frameworks. For instance, Dickie mentioned about the different legal frameworks between the Francophone and Anglophone. We took into account all these variations and came up with the AU model law to support countries to have effective legal frameworks that help them not only to ensure that they're able to undertake all the regulatory functions, but also to have autonomy, to be able to recruit their own staff, and also to participate in these regional processes. So that in itself has really helped shape the way business is conducted on the continent when it comes to regulation. We have more than 17 countries that have adopted the AU model law. And I think that's a very good starting point when it comes to monoclonal antibodies. And I think we'll continue with the discussion to see how best we can advance, especially the recommendations that are coming from the report. I'll stop here for now.
No, Margaret, thank you very, very much for those interventions, and especially reminding us about the model law and how that model law can be used to really help countries build effective institutions to regulate medical products on the continent. In terms of capabilities to, bringing in experts to work with the regulatory authorities, we've had sometimes regulatory authorities are very limited to bring in the full range of experts. And maybe let me ask Henry here, from the experience of SAPRA and, the experiences of COVID, do you see an opportunity here to leverage, experts from academia and other settings to come in and work with the regulator to provide the expertise that may be required where reliance is not possible? Of course, I will hear a little bit more about reliance, but where you really need to undertake your own assessment. Do you see opportunities there, drawing in expertise from the academia and other settings?
Hi, thank you, David. Yes, and to a certain extent, no. Look, when it comes to biologics, which now includes your monoclonal antibodies, I mean, the most important thing is obviously to have a fundamental understanding of the kind of molecule you're dealing with. In other words, the background biochemistry, etc., how they are expressed in cells, the basic manufacturing process. I mean, these you can share with regulators in the form of a workshop, lectures, and I've done it myself. I have been training SAPRA regulatory officials. I've even gone and gave a workshop on more than one occasion to the Botswana Regulatory Authority. But what I've discovered, and I think other people who have presented workshops on other topics have probably discovered the same thing, is that during the workshop, the sharing of knowledge, I mean, there is a lot of excitement and eagerness on the part of participants. But after that, when they have to go back to their workspace and actually pick up a dossier, it's a different ballgame. It's one thing to share knowledge. It's another thing to actually build an experience in the evaluation of applications. So there's really two parts of training. And the most important part for me is to assist with skills transfer. In other words, oversee the officials actually doing an evaluation and then guiding them through the whole process from beginning to the end. Now, this, you cannot just do it in 1 week. This is a stepwise procedure that may take a month or even more. And with experience, of course, it will become easier and easier. It's one thing to put lecture slides on the screen and tell them, okay, these are the components of the dossier, and this is where you find this type of information and that information, etc. These are the specifications. So teaching in a class is fine, but to pick up a dossier, which is a very extensive document, as you probably know, and going through it and reading it, and not just reading in order to summarize, but reading in order to evaluate, it's a totally different ballgame. And it takes many years. I mean, I've done this now for more than 10 years. And every time I pick up a dossier, I learn something new. But you have to start somewhere. And from my experience, what I would advocate for is not just lectures given by academics, but real evaluators that will take an official, a regulatory official by the hand and guide that person over a period of time to work through the dossier and to give feedback. That is really, really the only way. Workshops are fine for a week, etc., and lectures are fine, but at the end of that, there is still this massive, I don't know if it's just a psychological effort that you need to, sort of instill or encourage people to undertake, but to open a dossier and start reading from the first page, etc., it's not an easy task. We have a guideline, but a guideline is not a detailed document. It just gives you an overview of what you should have in the dossier, the kind of information, but it's not detailed enough for you to do an actual assessment. What does the data mean in the dossier, and how does it relate, for example, the specification to the method section or the properties or characteristics or whatever the case may be. It's not an easy exercise, and I think this is a reason why after many years of giving workshops, I still haven't I can't claim to have trained a regulatory official to actually do an evaluation, either at SAPRA or at BOMRA. What the best I can do in a week, for example, is just to, give them the lectures and then take them through an amendment application, let them gain experience at that level. But I have proposed that, for example, after the initial lectures, they take up a dossier, and maybe now it's a lot easier because we can do this remotely, but so that the officials or personnel can evaluate and then send me reports. But it's a very long process, and it is time consuming for them as well as for the instructor. So if we can somehow find a way of doing that, I can't come up with an easier way, but this is what is required to instill experience. It has to be hand-on. It's not just lectures which you can get from the web. It is, experience, taking a person by the hand and working with that person so that the person completes the dossier from beginning to the end, and explaining what the information means and how they should interpret the data. It's not just reading and summarizing a dossier, which is also what I see a lot of evaluators do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry.
I couldn't agree more with some of these important comments made. And indeed, if I may add, that this clearly is the basis of...
In 30 seconds, please. Thank you.
Yes. In the base of... Yes, yeah. This is why this has formed the basis of the WHO approach to ensuring that there is networking, work sharing, and also expertise sharing, so that countries work across, regulators work on a common evaluation process, gain experience, share experience with regulators from other regions of the world. And as you said, so that you get a hands-on approach and experience rather than merely a series of lectures. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Dickie, for those additions. Absolutely. I think we're hearing this practical element here being very, very important to building capability. Let me bring in Dr. Mugondi here. In terms of the work that you've done with, clinical trials in Southern Africa through your network on monoclonal antibodies, what do you think are some of the things that we can glean into that, and how has that enabled the building of regulatory capabilities from your own work on the clinical trial side?
So thank you very much, David, and thank you to IAVI and all the leadership here for inviting me. And I'm here representing my unit, University of Zimbabwe Clinical Trials Research Center, and the HIV Prevention Network. So as some of you might know, I am one of the co-chairs for the multi-center clinical trial, the AMP study, the monoclonal, the antibody-mediated prevention studies, which really were the first trials to assess if antibodies can be used to prevent HIV infection, similar to how other antibodies are used to prevent other infectious diseases. So yes, this was a large proof of concept study, and it was the first of its kind, not only here in Zimbabwe, but across many other sub-Saharan African countries. So from where I stand as protocol co-chair and also as the lead, in-country lead, I think I glimpsed some gaps in knowledge as well as capacity shortcomings in our regulators. If I might share, for us in Zimbabwe here, this proof of concept, it took us 13 months to get approvals to start to implement the study. So what did I think were some of the shortcomings in country? We have a multi-layered regulatory approval process. So I want us to come back perhaps to harmonization. My previous colleagues here, the previous speakers, they've talked on training of regulators, for example, on regulation of monoclonal antibodies, but I would really like to zone in on harmonized approaches for preclinical studies as well as clinical trials. So I think one of the lacking or the deficits in terms of the review of such clinical trials was lack of harmonization. And in my own opinion, I think if I were to advise the regulators, I think successful harmonization will require a strong visionary leadership, a supportive organizational and policy environment, dedicated resources in infrastructure for harmonization, as well as good communication. And we need oversight of these harmonization processes. So I think that's where I would start. We need to capacitate our regulators. And perhaps let me differ a bit with Henry. He did talk about the inclusion of academia into regulators. I think it's important because when I look back at the processes that I went through as the lead in Zimbabwe, as well as the lead across all the sites that took part in AMP, we had a lot of stakeholders engagement, and it helped to allay some of the myths and misconceptions and some of the knowledge gaps. So for example, in Zimbabwe, I think when we started AMP, we only had a few monoclonal antibodies registered, for example, Herceptin. I can't remember the other few that were registered then. So we had to take our other regulators. Of course, Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe was on top of this, but the other regulators, we had to inform them that this is a monoclonal antibody, which is similar to the one we are using, for example, Herceptin. So the inclusion of academia into the regulatory process was important in my own opinion, and I would really like to advocate for that. And it shouldn't be just a one-off process. It must be ongoing, and we should have a platform for the academics to really contact or to be in touch with the regulators. Yeah, so I think I'll start there and stop there. And I would really like to advocate for harmonization so that there are not many regulatory processes. In my country, I think sometimes when we are, I'm trying to think how many regulators I have to submit to. It could be anything from 7 to 8, each one of them with slightly different requirements. So we need harmonization. And I'm really happy, despite AMP having taken so long, 13 months to get approval, because it was the first of its own kind, a proof of concept. I'm happy to know that Zimbabwe, we've started in terms of harmonization. I know the Medicines Control Authority of Zimbabwe, as well as the Medical Research Council of Zimbabwe, they are working on a harmonized application process for clinical trials and other studies. So yeah. So we need to create a robust, harmonized system, but without cutting on the efficiency or on the review process. But harmonization, I think this is the biggest gap I noted as we prepared for the first ever monoclonal antibody study. But as we came into co-VPN, things have really improved, and our turnaround times have really improved. And I know this is because we've started on harmonization in the country. So kudos to our regulators there. But I think there's always room for improvement.
No, thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nyiradzo, for sharing that experience around, why harmonization is key for clinical development, but also across the other elements of the life cycle. We're really running out of time, but it's really critical that we talk about AMA and how AMA might help us address some of these issues. And Margaret, I want to come back to you and Dickie as well on, harmonization, making sure that we have a singular set of technical requirements to help, accelerate clinical trial reviews and authorization, but also marketing authorization. Margaret, what does AMA offer us in this space? Is this one of the products that AMA might be able to help us leverage the limited expertise on the continent, but also drive harmonization in 1 minute? We need to close in 2 minutes. I give you 1 minute, Margaret.
I think you have the answer there. AMA is really coming to take on the work that we're doing under the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. And one of the core elements that AMA is going to address is really, a review of complex molecules, be it, vaccines, these monoclonal antibodies and so forth. So AMA is the way to go, and we are busy trying to see how we can put structures to ensure that we facilitate the review process, especially for complex molecules through the African Medicines Agency. I will stop here.
Thank you very much, Margaret. Dickie, I know that on the Africa Vaccine Regulatory Forum platform, you've been doing quite a bit of work in harmonizing clinical trial processes and requirements. Do you want to tell us in 1 minute, what you're doing there for those who may not be familiar with the AVRF platform and how that connects with AMA? 1 minute, Professor Kamori.
Yeah, thank you very much, David, and I'll be very brief. Yes, so harmonization is actually the basis of all the work around the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum. And the intention is to bring countries, regulatory authorities closer to each other, share information, share the work, share the expertise, and at the same time, with respect to clinical trials, to bring ethics committees much closer to each other, and also to the national regulatory authorities, because that's the only way you can get a clinical trial efficiently, application efficiently reviewed, when you have everybody talking to each other and you eliminate the duplication, because you don't need 2 ethics committee reviews in one country, totally unnecessary. And where the regulators speak with the ethics committees, you are likely to get a more transparent, a well-structured system with predictable timelines for every step, and the sponsor can then make decisions based on the timelines which are available. And I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Dickie, for that. Henry, I want to give you 15 seconds. Any final words from you, Henry, on this very important process and journey?
Okay. When we developed our biosimilars guideline, for example, in South Africa, we took a very long time, but in the end we realized, look, when companies submit their application, whether it's for the innovator or biosimilar product, they do a global submission. They submit to many regulatory authorities. In fact, when I did a study and I spoke to some of the multinational companies in South Africa, they said, look, they just do a single submission, a global submission. It's one submission going to all the regulatory authorities with the same data. So if we're going to receive the same dossier that the EMA and FDA and everybody else will receive, then basically, we should use the same data, the same guidelines. And for this reason, when we developed our biosimilars guideline, for example, we looked at WHO and EMA guidelines, etc., and we just base our guideline on that, because the requirements are the same. The requirements for quality, safety, and efficacy from an authorization perspective should be the same. The reason why we like to refer to EMA is because they've gone a step further and they've developed product-specific guidelines. They've got a guideline for monoclonal antibodies, for example, and one for filgrastim and one for insulin, whereas most of us, we've just developed a general guideline. Okay, but if I'm going to evaluate a monoclonal antibody, I'm going to access the EMA monoclonal antibody guideline to help me work through the dossier. I mean, Australia, when they never developed the biosimilars guideline, they just said we adopt EMA guidelines. And that was probably the best decision. And it saved them a lot of time and money, etc. So harmonization is excellent. But, if I can just recall in terms of pharmaceuticals, we've been doing this in Southern Africa for more than 10 years, from MCC days already. And I think the time has come now really to converge towards global guidelines, adopt the best guidelines that there are there and work with those, when it comes to authorization of products. And I think here in South Africa, we've done that. That was our decision. And so that is not really the limiting step for us. For us is the skills development, to get a person to work through a dossier. Thank you very much. So.
Henry, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I've got to bring this to a close. It's very interesting, but we've got to move on. Thank you all very much. I want to thank the panelists for your time and your wonderful interventions. There's a lot more to discuss, but for another day. Ayesha, back to you.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the panelists. And this is a great segue into the session, the second session. And for that, I will pass it over to Yolanda Moyo, who is Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at IAVI, and she will do the introductions. Thank you so much. Yolanda, you're on mute, so you may want to unmute.
Thank you so much, Aisha, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. The first half of this webinar has really brought some insights, useful insights for us. As we've been listening to the panelists, it has become very apparent that with varying levels of regulatory capacity across Africa, the discourse ceases to be just an African discourse. It becomes a global discourse to come together, establish solutions to strengthen and harmonize regulatory policy frameworks to enable broader and expeditious access to monoclonal antibodies in Africa. So without further ado, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce the first speaker for the second half of this webinar, Ms. Shelley Malhotra. Shelley is the Global Access Senior Director at IAVI, and she will be sharing and setting the context for this second half of the webinar with a presentation of a report that she co-authored with IAVI colleagues on evolving access pathways for long-acting HIV prevention products, including HIV broadly neutralizing antibodies. Over to you, Shelley.
Thanks, Yolanda. And as Yolanda mentioned, I'd like to shift gears to focus on HIV, which, as Helen also mentioned earlier, in so many ways has been a vanguard for establishing broad access to innovations in resource-limited settings, and also which is an area in which we have a robust pipeline of monoclonal antibodies. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so next slide. I'd like to start by thanking our donors. Next slide. So today I'll be providing highlights from the Evolving Access Pathways for Long-Acting HIV Prevention Products report. And the goal of this report was to help accelerate access to future HIV prevention products by highlighting stakeholder perspectives on challenges and opportunities to accelerate broad access, by identifying evidence needed to support product adoption, and by exploring pathways for regulatory approval, as well as policy integration, financing, procurement, and delivery. And this report was based on insights from 57 individuals from 22 organizations that were interviewed, and those groups are listed here. And as you can see, they run the gamut from regulatory to those involved in policy guidance, financing, supply and procurement, and health systems delivery. Next slide. I'll just quickly set the stage by saying that there's a robust pipeline of HIV prevention products, and these really transcend product type in terms of ARV-based products, antibody-based products, multi-prevention technologies, as well as transcending delivery modalities. And this diversity requires careful consideration in terms of what the pathways to access are and how they might differ for products, particularly for biologics, as opposed to small molecule or ARV-based products. Next slide. So I'll dive into some of the key findings from the report, first starting with product registration. As we all know, product registration is critical in terms of long-term sustainable access and pharmacovigilance, but historically there's been significant lags in registering products in Africa. And on the right here, it's a little bit light, but I just pulled in a snapshot of the COVID vaccine approvals to date to really highlight the point that if you look at the global map, while the majority of countries globally across all regions of the world have at least attained limited approval or authorization for one vaccine option, we see that in Africa, approvals are still quite limited. Even limited approvals are restricted. And there's several reasons for why we see such delays that have been mentioned already. I think first, we need to acknowledge that there is a delay in filing in LMICs, including those countries in Africa, which often are not seen as a top priority in commercialization strategies. And historically, there's been a lack of harmonized requirements that has been discussed already today in quite depth, as well as mutual recognition, which means that companies aren't able to use the same dossier. Countries have not relied on common reference standards historically, and these factors, as has been discussed, can lead to duplicative or longer timelines in terms of filing across a large number of countries. And these challenges are compounded, as has been mentioned, for antibodies. Many regulatory authorities lack dedicated capacity for the assessment of biotherapeutics and lack specific procedures for their evaluation. So in terms of key recommendations, efforts are needed to further scale up joint review and reliance-based mechanisms, such as those that have been discussed today, particularly for antibodies. And this can help accelerate timelines. It can help encourage broad regulatory filing and also build capacity, as has been discussed today. And the experience with the Ervebo Ebola vaccine provides a really exciting example of how this could work. WHO pre-qualification was secured just days after the EU conditional marketing approval, and collaborative registration in several African countries occurred within months of that, and this was due to the close collaboration during the review process. We also need to apply the same agility and urgency that we've seen in high-income countries in our COVID regulatory response. We need to apply that same urgency globally and across a wider range of products. Next slide. So moving on to integration into WHO policy guidance. WHO policy is a key enabler of broad adoption of new products, but what we've seen in the HIV space with oral PrEP experience, and in the malaria space with RTSS, is that gaps in programmatic evidence related to feasibility, acceptability, and program implementation can lead to conditional recommendations and the need for additional demonstration studies post-licensure, which delay impact. Additionally, in the case of antibodies as biologics, they've historically had different pathways for policy guidance, financing, and procurement. And within policy-making bodies, antibodies straddle the vaccines, biologics groups, and the disease program areas. And these factors all contribute to an added level of complexity, which requires significant coordination. So in terms of key recommendations, early engagement and coordination are critical, as are gathering clinical and programmatic evidence concurrently to ensure timely and broad guidance. Next slide. In terms of financing and procurement, the platforms for LMIC procurement have often been these large mechanisms, such as the Global Fund, Gavi, COVAX, in the COVID space, PEPFAR. And they've been critical for access. However, there's gaps in coverage that need to be addressed. There's overall funding gaps. And these funding gaps are more acute for countries that are transitioning from donor support to self-procurement and financing, who not only face a loss of funding, but are also confronted with increased costs related to for commodities because they're unable to benefit from volume-based pricing negotiations. And for antibody-based products, they're not currently integrated into financing and procurement platforms. And that's been a huge obstacle to their affordability and historically to their availability. And historically, they have not been affordable because they haven't been developed with the needs and requirements of resource limited settings in mind. This includes, in terms of their product profile, they've often been high dose, requiring IV administration, and also in terms of the pricing structures and the business models used to advance them. So in terms of key recommendations, in this context of resource scarcity, products must be developed with a focus on affordability from the start in terms of the product profile and the business models to advance them. And this includes exploring innovative public-private partnership models that prioritize access and availability at their center. And finally, it's important to extend the benefits of pool procurement to a wider range of countries and to a wider range of products by delinking it from income status. And the COVAX and PAHO models provide a very helpful examples for how this might work. And finally, moving on to delivery and implementation. Next slide. Factors such as stigma, product-related issues, and delivery hurdles can limit both supply, demand, and uptake of monoclonal antibodies. We've seen this in the COVID space and is also a concern in the HIV prevention field. but it's often not until late into development that these issues are flagged, and often by that time it's too late to address them in terms of the product design or delivery requirements. Also, antibodies carry unique delivery considerations, often including requirements for clinic-based administration potentially, or cold chain storage that must be navigated. So in terms of recommendations, it's critical to engage with communities and implementers early in development to understand potential acceptability and delivery barriers, and to ensure they're factored in product design and program design. So next slide, just to conclude and summarize, it's critical that we begin early in these efforts and ensure early dialogue and coordination. Innovative partnerships strategies are going to be needed to help catalyze affordability and broad availability. And it's critical that we streamline and strengthen regulatory pathways, and also strengthen coordination from early development working through product introduction. It's important also that clinical and programmatic evidence are gathered concurrently. Next slide. And finally, it's critical that we invest adequately in future products, that we develop strategies to sustainably pool procurement and support global distribution, and that we reimagine product design and delivery approaches so that we're identifying and addressing acceptability and implementation barriers early in product development. And finally, I just wanted to, on the next slide, acknowledge Merck for their financial support for this report, as well as those individuals who were mentioned on in organizations on slide 4 who participated in consultations, and then the folks listed here who helped to provide feedback on the report. And next slide. And I want to thank our donors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Shelley. It's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the second panel, Dr. Janice Bernard, who's the Scientific and Regulatory Affairs Director at IFPMA. Janice, over to you.
Thanks, Yolanda, and thank you to Wellcome and IAVI for allowing me to be here this afternoon. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to specifically read the bios of our panelists, but you can see them on the screen, and thank you for that. And I think I just want to go ahead and jump into the discussion. And today's discussion, at least for panel 2, is focused specifically on access and availability to monoclonal antibodies in Africa. And then how does that relate to regulation and global collaboration and learning? So I would ask that all the panelists in session 2, please come off mute and put your videos on, please. And I know that we do have some of our panelists that need to leave at 4 p.m. Sharp. So I want to go ahead and just go ahead and get started. And I'm asking, I'm going to start with the ladies of our panels first, Agnes, Yvette, and Nevena. You know, you've heard from panel 1 about what's going on with the African Medicines Agency, about the different regulatory collaboration, and you know, some of the things and resources that are needed in order to ensure availability of medicines and vaccines on the continent. But I'd like to first maybe get your view of the problem statement, if you will, just briefly, so we can go through everybody on this panel. Is from your various perspectives, what do you think are the factors and the reasons that we may have limited availability of monoclonal antibodies in Africa? So I'd like to start there. And maybe Agnes, you first, please.
Thank you, Janice. Hello, everybody. Apologies because I missed part of the first one, but I guess a lot has been said already. For me, the reasons are of course multifactorial. I'm not inventing anything here. I think the cost is the big aspect, probably. Maybe the fear of the cost more than the cost itself. We see more and more biosimilars, so certainly we will have more competition and the cost will decrease, but there is an element there for all biologicals in general. The second aspect is probably more related to the infrastructure. Is there infrastructure to get the patient in hospital for the treatment? Because most of them are injectable. You need the material, you need the personnel, you need the monitoring. So this is adding to the complexity of it's not a single pill that you take. And beyond that is probably the fact that these products are not manufactured in Africa. They are manufactured elsewhere and have to be imported. And maybe that's also an area that should be looked at. There is a lot of interest currently to try to implant and develop manufacturing sites in Africa. That may be one of the aspects that should be looked at. I don't want to take too long, but I think these are the main thing. We see more and more biosimilar on the list of essential medicines of WHO, but the level of uptake of these products in reality, I have to say I don't know. Maybe it's been addressed before. Sorry. Over.
So thank you, Agnes. A very salient point. So Yvette, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for IAVI for having me on this panel. I represent US Pharmacopoeia, but I'll speak and mirror, in fact, comments made by Helen because I come from a vaccines background. And you know, looking at some of the issues here, I see a great deal of similarity to issues that we faced early on in the introduction of new vaccines. This was talking in the late 1990s, and we were very much stuck on affordability issues. That was what people were wringing their hands about for a long time, and it was certainly part of the issue. But as it turns out, the solution wasn't just there. I think it was a multi-pronged approach, and we can't discount the importance of the WHO pre-qualification process for vaccines, which in fact predates Gavi. And was really fundamental in helping bring vaccines, affordable vaccines, to the market. There was, of course, Gavi mechanisms and the UNICEF bulk procurement, which helped mobilize the demand and affect the prices. But very importantly, and often not fully recognized, is the whole policy structures around supporting the introduction of these vaccines, starting from the WHO SAGE process to the really expansion of mechanisms in countries called NITAGs, which allowed for the frequent review of the possibilities and the assessment of whether any individual vaccine was appropriate to a given country's position and circumstances at a point in time, allowing for a comprehensive assessment of whether that particular vaccine made sense for introduction. So those policy structures are also really key. And as we look to monoclonal antibodies, the challenge that I see is not just on the regulatory front, obviously, as what we're discussing today, but the fact that the antibodies, as we mentioned before, to straddle different therapeutic areas, it makes perhaps more challenging the ability to bulk procure, certainly the policy discussions. But I think that issue of how to bring global policy discussions on this down to frequent assessments at the national level are really important. The other thing I would like to highlight is that the ability to effectively and efficiently regulate monoclonal antibodies are not separate at all from the market incentives. So they have to grow together, because this is what's going to drive interest in producers to submit dossiers in a timely fashion. And this is also going to influence the financing models of regulatory agencies that could include user fees or other. So they really need to be looked at it as running in parallel and really together, processes that run together.
Okay, thank you, Yvette. And you're correct in that a lot of, I think, lessons from vaccine introduction can be leveraged to monoclonal antibodies. So Nevena, I'd like to ask you, from your perspective as chair of the Africa Regulatory Network for IFPMA, but also as a policy lead for Roche, your thoughts on this initial question of some of the reasons for the limited availability and accessibility of monoclonal antibodies in Africa.
Thank you, Janice, and thanks for having me here, to the organizers. So in general, I think a lot has been already said by previous participants, and I believe that strong regulatory systems based on international standards, as Professor Lang mentioned, are foundation, and they could ensure appropriate quality, safety, and efficacy of approved monoclonal antibodies. And also collaboration and reliance practices could accelerate approvals in the countries after either pre-qualification or approval by stringent regulatory authorities. However, what we have also heard and what we've seen from practice is that broader, holistic, and most of all, sustainable healthcare system enhancement discussions beyond just regulatory is needed to ensure that appropriate ecosystems are established for adequate, efficient, and safe applications of monoclonal antibodies. What I do believe is that awareness of availability of these products and also including disease burden, epidemiological data in the countries, and priorities of countries' healthcare systems, together with the education of all involved stakeholders, not just regulators, but also healthcare professionals, patients, payers, ensuring that right health system capacity is also in place. Infrastructure, Agnes was mentioning earlier, you know, that all those medicines are actually quite specific in terms of application. But not just that, also diagnostic procedures need to be established, and education and access to trained medical professionals. Then also market access practices that could allow that products to be actually used as a standard of care in certain disease areas. And something which I didn't hear earlier, but also appropriate pharmacovigilance systems in place are all the prerequisites that we could talk about broader availability of those medicines. And to conclude, this part, I mean, is already proven in the past and also during recent pandemic situation. Industry welcomes the opportunity to collaborate with other stakeholders in developing and finding the best modalities for ensuring access for all the patients in need. And what I can say for coming from the company side and also being pretty involved in African discussions, there are many companies that are having long-standing presence in the continent and are actually already partnering with the stakeholders in countries to ensure this sustainable environment for adequate applications for monoclonal antibodies.
Thanks, Nevena. And I think thank you to the Yvette and Agnes as well. This is quite a comprehensive overview. I'd like to take a little bit of shift and head over to the gentleman representing the World Health Organization this afternoon. And maybe, Richard, if I could start with you first. I think, you know, interested to get your thoughts, if you have something in addition to what you just heard. With regards to the lack of availability on the African continent of mAbs. But I think I'd also be very interested in hearing about your work that you do with regards to the development of technical guidelines and norms and standards. And then what's the impact of that, and how do you as WHO foresee that helping? And then Luther, I'll follow up with you afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Janice, and thank you to IAVI for inviting me to be a panelist. It's great to be here and to make a connection with so many of you. So to answer the question, I mean, I'm definitely not an expert in any sense of fashion as to why there, you know, in the problems in lack of availability within Africa. And I think most of my colleagues have pretty much touched on everything that I agreed on with them, you know, such as lack of harmonization of regulations and the need for reliance. I think two important points that are important that really haven't been touched on too much is one, I think it's very important to remember that mAbs monoclonal antibodies are extremely complex biologically, and much more so than many other biological therapeutics that we have, such as insulin, which is a much smaller molecule. And this complexity really complicates their regulation and their review. And so you can't really apply fully what you learned from one monoclonal antibody to all of the other ones. You really have to regulate them individually as one product at a time. And I think a second point that I've certainly seen in my past as a regulator is that the lack of harmonization between countries and between regions can really form a significant hurdle or a barrier for manufacturers due to the variations in like the clinical trial application or the registration process or the standardization or everything that they need to comply to get their single product into multiple countries. If you have different standards between different countries for one product from one manufacturer, that really imposes a lot of difficulties on them. And so we've found in the past that manufacturers will often prefer to market or to submit for marketing applications within those countries that have a common sense of specifications and standards and requirements, both for the clinical trials and for their quality in manufacturing. So I think that's really one aspect of it that's going to be very, that really needs to be considered. In terms of the your second part of your question, so right now we're doing in norms and standards division where I work in at WHO, is we do have guidelines that that apply to monoclonal antibodies in terms of their quality, their safety, and their efficacy. But as Henry really touched on, is that this is a very general guideline, and much of what we have tends to be very general. They have to be applicable to all of our member states, around the world, and not just one region. And this makes it very difficult to draft them. So really the predominant guideline that we have that's related to monoclonal antibodies is one for biotherapeutics derived from recombinant DNA technology, which is pretty much every biologic except for vaccines. So what we're doing now is we are currently drafting 2 guidance documents, one which is really specific to the manufacturing and quality control of monoclonal antibodies and related proteins, regardless of their intended use. And this would really help to establish the foundation of basic specifications that are required for their quality control across the board. And then the second document is regulatory considerations document on the preclinical and clinical evaluation of monoclonals for infectious diseases. Because the documents that we have now are really geared, the documents we have, the guidance documents that we have for that are related to monoclonal antibodies are really geared towards non-communicable diseases. That's really how they're written, and it's difficult to apply that or to take the lessons learned on how do you put that for infectious diseases such as COVID, HIV, RSV, etc. And so we're building a new guidance document to really help fill that gap. What are those preclinical and clinical situations that you really need to be evaluating for infectious diseases? Because for non-communicable diseases, monoclonal antibodies or other biotherapeutics are really targeting endogenous human proteins, whereas for infectious diseases, you're really looking at non-endogenous. These are proteins or targets that are coming from the infectious agent. So how you would test that is very, very different, and how you run your clinical trials is quite different. So along with those 2 documents, we're building supplements that are more disease specific. So as Henry says, we can provide much more detail or greater you provide greater detail and guidance to the regulators on very specific products. So we're hoping that this harmonization will allow regulators around the world, including Africa, to really have a set foundation in which they can form the basis of their decisions, and that manufacturers have a base foundation on which they can apply their specifications that would be similar across the board. And I'll leave that at that.
Thank you for that. And I think I added something I was thinking about just at the end, is it's a good foundation. It is not just for regulators, it's also for better understanding from industry and manufacturers on what the expectations will be. So thank you. Thank you for that. So Luther, last but not least, in understanding your role at WHO, there's a focus for you on helping member states, countries with national registration of products, as well as facilitating pre-qualification and some of the collaborative registration procedures. And we heard in the previous panel session, but then we also heard now that there's a lot of focus on the need for harmonization, the need for convergence. And I wanted to ask you, in the experience that you've obviously had with COVID-19 and with the emergency use listing of vaccines, and eventually those will go towards pre-qualification. Are there any parallels or experiences from that or other experience with collaborative registration procedures that you think could be leveraged towards enabling availability of monoclonal antibodies in Africa? And I appreciate that's a very complicated question, but you know, go ahead and do with it as you will. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And also thank you for inviting me to participate here in the panel discussion. And I think it is an important topic. And a lot of the key issues I think were mentioned in the previous, I think, introductory presentation. I think that sort of sets the context for what we are talking about. And the answer is definitely yes. I think for regulators, when you're looking at monoclonal antibodies, I think from a systems perspective, you do not necessarily separate that from other products which they are regulating. And in that context, the tools that are already in place, for example, issues of reliance also apply, because you know what you do for pharmaceuticals are the same things that you do for the monoclonal antibodies. The only difference is when it comes to the issue of guidelines, you know, that you need to actually have specific guidelines there. And the other one is competency, that you need to have the necessary competencies within your regulatory authority. And I think this is where the experience that is already there can be leveraged in this context. And there are already some examples where this has been done. I think we've had cases where collaborative registration based on EMA approval, as well as joint reviews within regional communities has been used for biological products. So there's already experience there. And also even for biosimilar products. But I think the key thing for regulators, apart from having the requirements or the guidelines, is also to ensure two things. I think we are looking at making sure they approve quality assured products, but also timely. And that can only be done by relying on what others have done. And I think we've spoke about this in many ways, and I think other people have highlighted it. And one of the key things which I want to emphasize is when it comes to guidelines, you know, and I think it might also contribute to the fact that some manufacturers may take time to submit to African countries. If you look at the previous, I think, figures, when you're talking about approvals, you'd find that you have maybe, I think, 70 approvals in the US, and then I think there was Nigeria and Zimbabwe, they had 4 or 7. And part of that, apart from the other factors on affordability, could be the issue of requirements, that, you know, if the country don't have clear requirements, it may affect or the interest of manufacturers to submit. And I think Prof. Leng mentioned a classical example, because regulators are spending a lot of time trying to come up with individual guidelines. And the moment they do that, you are going to have lack of harmonization, you know, and that again complicates the issue. And I think there we can leverage on what others have already done, you know, in terms of adopting existing guidelines, because there you already sort of harmonize. And I think I want to emphasize that the TGA approach is probably something that other countries should follow. You don't have to spend your time developing the guidelines. You just adopt and then provide clarification in terms of where you have country-specific issues. So that's one. And then the second one is on reliance. The same guidelines we have are applicable. There's no need to develop new guidelines in terms of collaborative procedure. We can use the same. And COVID-19 is I think we can draw some parallels, but it's slightly unique in the sense that everybody has got a lot of pressure to make decisions. You know, the regulators have pressure to approve these vaccines, or to at least give some regulatory authorization or listing to facilitate deployment. So I think that added sort of pressure adds to quick decisions being made by regulators. And then when you're looking at the monoclonal antibodies, if you're dealing with a normal situation, I think that added pressure is not there. But I think we can sort of use the experience with vaccines, that it is feasible, it is possible for regulators to make quick decisions, to also rely on decisions made by others, whether it's from pre-qualification or it's from other agencies. It is actually possible and it can be done. And then those issues of trying to develop local expertise can be balanced. You know, in what cases do you need to have the local expertise? In what cases do you need to actually leverage on the expertise from elsewhere?
Thank you. Anya, since you're the one that has to unfortunately leave us, would anything you'd like to build on what you just heard?
Actually, I really agree with Luther as usual, but I want to highlight the fact that there is no difference for biologicals, be they vaccines or monoclonal antibodies, in terms of procedures, reliance, and so on. The same principle should apply and can apply. What is maybe missing in the countries is the expertise to assess this, as was said, complex product. And but this is where probably training, collaborative assessment, and also joint assessment, as we've done for the Ebola vaccine in Rwanda. We had the 16 authorities, and our assessors in the CHMP share their assessment with the assessors in the countries, and they are trying to identify where were the issues, how they were solved, and so on. And I think that is the best exercise, because it gives value to everybody. Everybody has to assess, but at the end there is some sort of consensus building or explanatory phase where people can share their doubts, their difficulties, and progress. And this is also building capacity over time. So I really believe this is the way forward. It takes time, it takes resources. That's most difficult for everybody, especially currently. But I think it's really the way forward. But we don't need to reinvent another system. It already exists, and reliance is there in the meantime for the transition until such time as a capacity is built. And guidelines, yes, please do not develop parallel guidelines. There's no point in having a slight difference in a guideline, which is not justified. It's just a way of saying we exist, we have our guidelines. ICH has shown that the way forward is to have a common guideline. We just put our name on the same content. So really that's a message for everybody. We're happy to engage as much as we can, depending on our resources, but I think we have extensive experience of biosimilars in particular, and for monoclonal antibody, I think it's very relevant to make them affordable. It's really, I think price is a big issue, but we can use reliance. We can also work together towards building capacity. Over.
Thank you, Agnes. Greatly appreciated, and glad we were able to get you in before you have to leave. So thank you so much. So maybe I'm just gonna change the order a little bit. Nevena, just any thoughts from your perspective with regards to the reliance, aspect from an industry perspective, as well as some of these issues around streamlining requirements, and before we then move to Yvette and get some thoughts from you as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Janice. So I think all what previous speakers said is quite aligned what industry position is. We recently had the opportunity to, speaking about reliance actually, we recently had the opportunity to organize the first stakeholders event on the joint assessment procedures together with the regulators from the regions across Africa. And there as well, the similar discussion was held, and we realized that the challenges that we are facing from the industry side are actually similar, like the challenges that the regulators are having. It is really needed to be mentioned here that there are so many good examples, and African regulators actually paved the road with all this AMRH initiative activities, and also with the regional joint assessment procedures. There are also some good examples where they developed regulations that are actually addressing biotherapeutics. And the next step is their appropriate implementation. Another point that has been raised just by previous speaker is around international standards implementation, and ICH being one of the organizations that we also are seeing as a very important one for the countries to look at. Because some of the challenges that we've seen are actually related to those very country-specific requirements. And that's something which delays both submission procedures and also the whole assessment procedures. On the other side, what has been said about the pooling expertise and the joint assessment, I see nice parallel, and maybe Agnes would elaborate about that later on, but we've heard about establishment of African Medicines Agency, and we know that European agency actually has very good collaboration and joint assessment procedures on their part. So potentially centralized procedure is actually a very nice parallel that could be utilized for development of appropriate systems in Africa and African Medicines Agency. In terms of education, there are possibilities that we see also in other regions, and establishment of some form of regional centers of regulatory excellence or utilization of the training possibilities that WHO is offering or ICH is offering is also something that we should explore more in Africa. So to conclude, I mean, we believe that the utilization of collaborative procedures and reliance should be maximized, especially for the products of like monoclonal antibodies. And to add to that, utilization of reliance across the whole life cycle from clinical development to post-approval setup is also something that we need to have in mind that could support not just fast uptake of these medicines, but also their continuous supply as they're available ones. So I'll stop here and allow for other comments.
Thanks, Nevada. I don't know, Agnes, one last comment before you go, or? Oops, you're still on mute. Uh-oh. Okay, unfortunately, I think Agnes, we're unable to hear you.
Sorry, no, I was on a phone call and reminding me that I have to be at 4 sharp in another meeting. Sorry.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, we'll leave you to it then, and thank you so much for participating. Great. So Yvette, apologies, but we'll get to you now. So USP has been very well known for its work on capacity and capability work in the continent as well. So based on what you've just heard, I'd like to get a little bit of a sense from you on, what is USP doing, maybe now and continuing to doing, and what do you think is also maybe there's some elements, broader than just the streamlining convergence that you would like to consider and discuss?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. So USP has a USAID funded program called Promoting the Quality of Medicines, PQM Plus. And what we do is we support countries, including countries in Africa, for local production. But this goes beyond the manufacturers. We take very much a holistic view to it. So we support both local production, the manufacturers, regulatory capacity, and laboratories. And they all need to go together in order to have a proper ecosystem for local production. And this becomes, I think, relevant, increasingly relevant to the monoclonal antibody situation, partly as if we want a silver lining to the COVID-19 situation and the inequities that have been, that we're seeing and continuing to see from that. Because these inequities, particularly for vaccines, have driven the African Union and the African CDC and other global partners to really prioritize and develop a vision for African vaccine manufacturing, and they've developed an African vaccine manufacturing framework, which aims to provide 60% of the routine immunization needs in Africa through locally produced products by 2040. This it will drive, of course, the need, well, local production of vaccines, but of biological facilities in general, and the need to keep these facilities warm, which means that it opens the space for production of adjacent technologies like monoclonal antibodies within Africa in a way that I think was not as clearly envisioned as possible prior to COVID-19. So what we see is that these ambitious plans to bring biological production capacity to Africa really need to be mirrored by an equal boldness in regulatory capacity within Africa that goes maybe beyond just what we've envisioned before, to the ability to actually inspect facilities, validate, lot release, and a whole range of regulatory functions that go beyond what perhaps was envisioned before. And in this view, I think there are a few things that are going to be very important. One is that
sorry, Yvette, we're running out of time. Could I ask you just to wrap up those last few points pretty quickly?
Sure. So one is that we probably need knowledge transfer that goes in parallel to sort of technology transfer that would be needed for production. But then, and this gets to the point of harmonization and convergence, this becomes even more important with regards to the prospect of developing local production within Africa, because it becomes essential to the market cohesion within the African continent. So it simply reinforces the messages that have already been laid out before. And I think it also brings an issue that we haven't touched on too much, but around the financing and sustainability of these regulatory agencies and the centralized bodies that hopefully will come to be. This also becomes important if we're going to have this in large capacity. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. And I think I'll hand it back over to Aisha and Yolanda for Q&A. But I'd like on behalf of myself to thank you for a wonderful panel. I know things are a bit quick in the planning, but thank you so much for being flexible, and really appreciated to hear your views. So Yolanda and Aisha, thank you.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Janice, for really helping out and moderating, really so excellently this panel, and to the panel as well. I want to say we actually got some really interesting questions, some of which were answered live and through text. We will follow up with all the questions. I wanted to acknowledge, in fact, a question by Sharon Ann Lynch on affordability. I don't think we discussed that in depth today, but certainly a lot of that is presented in the report around the ideas around innovation and innovative business and pricing models to address affordability. So I certainly refer you to the report, as well as we will follow up with answers to a number of your questions separately. I wanted to really thank the audience for attending and staying through both panel discussions, the organizers, the panelists, and all of you for attending today. It's been really a great discussion. Thank you, everybody, and so long.